What is a creche? So generally defined, the creche is a three-dimensional representation of the birth of Jesus using movable figures in the sense that they can be moved around and rearranged. And they include artistic elements such as houses, rocks, plants, other landscaping outside of the main figures of the creche. So it's prepared for Christmas and removed at the time of purification. As such, the creche is strictly connected with the theater scene as well. Like the theater, it strives to make an event that is remote in time and space, current and relevant, and sometimes through theatrical illusion, depending on the artist's representation. So scholars have done a significant amount of research into the origins and the development of creches. Over the centuries, creches have changed and evolved. During the first phase, we call the ecclesiastical phase, nativity scenes were created first within the church in the form of paintings and then as sculptures, into altars and chapels specifically dedicated to the creche. In the second phase, the so-called aristocratic phase, the creche became popular among noble families whose displays were characterized by great pomp and ostentation. However, the greatest artistic results were also achieved in this period. And thereafter, the manger scene became essentially a folk tradition where we currently are today. The first representation of the Nativity is found in a fresco in the catacombs of St. Priscilla in Rome, dating to the 2nd and 3rd century. This shows the Madonna with the Christ child on her lap, and next to her is a man, Saint Joseph, or perhaps the prophet Isaiah, and above her is an 8-pointed star. So this is just a photograph of the catacombs in which these frescoes were found. So the catacombs of St. Priscilla also once contained the slab of Spera, dating to the 3rd century, and this funerary stone depicts the Nativity and for the first time includes the 3 Magi. So over the next 100 years, approximately up until the 5th century, many catacomb frescoes were produced with similar representations of the Epiphany. Although the catacomb of St. Sebastian, dating to the 4th century, also in Rome, does not contain representations of Mary or Joseph, it does show a type of manger with an ox and donkey for the first time. Subsequently, between the 4th and 6th centuries, the shepherds appear in reliefs done on marble sarcophagi, and slowly the manger scene as we know it today began to take shape. As noted, however, these presentations were reliefs, or later they were painted glass, miniatures, or mosaics, so not quite the style of creche that we know today. The first creche, scholars believe, well, up until the early 2000s, most scholars agreed that a marble sculpture by Alfano di Cambino, dating to the period around 1289, was the oldest creche in Italy. Even though some of its parts had been destroyed and others had been reworked, this work can still be admired in the Basilica of St. Mary in Rome, and up until 1870, many popes celebrated Christmas Mass in front of it. However, in the 1980s, scholars changed their opinion when a creche in the Church of the Holy Cross in Bologna, part of the complex of 7 churches commonly grouped together under the name of St. Stephen's Basilica, was in the process of restoration. So this richly adorned polychromatic and gilded wooden sculpture representing the Madonna with Child in Arms, St. Joseph and the Magi, had always been attributed to Simon di Crosini and dated to 1370. So it's now known that this sculpture was decorated in the 1300s, but had actually been carved in the 1200s. Unfortunately, we don't have any information on who carved it, but this is now believed to be the oldest creche in existence. So then moving on, so for the rest of the presentation, I'll start to highlight different creches that we have in the collection at Luma. So continuing on in the history of the creche, the Council of Trent, which took place in 1545 to 1563, established precise regulations regarding the worship of saints and reliquaries and promoted the diffusion of the creche as an expression of popular religiosity. The Jesuits, The new religious order founded by Saint Ignatius Loyola in 1540 took hold of the concept, almost monopolizing it. In their hands, the creche became a didactic tool to recapture the countries of the Reformation, and they thought to evangelize the recently discovered lands of the New World. So the Jesuit tradition of creches goes back quite a bit. The ostentatious ornamental effects that revolutionized the character of the creche first appeared and developed in the 17th century. Earlier creches reflected the most vivid aspects of daily reality, but the Baroque era also brought with it unusual and exotic elements and spectacular scenic effects. At the same time, the creche began to make its way out of churches and into the homes of the aristocracy and the upper bourgeoisie, the aristocratic era I mentioned earlier. So for them, it became a luxury decorative object that could be set up from one year to the next and rearranged in new ways over and over again, going back to a creche being defined as something that can be movable figures and be rearranged. So these large stationary statues were replaced by wooden mannequins, sometimes partly of straw, dressed in sumptuous cloth garments. The heads and limbs were made with terracotta, wax, or wood, and the expression of these mannequins allowed for and favored private displays. The Baroque creche reached its highest expression in Naples, Italy. Unlike the 18th century, Baroque splendors created in Naples and Sicily, and sometimes in Genoa, creches were becoming more simpler and less spectacular and responded more to historical reality in some of the other Italian regions. Then these figures were made primarily of carved wood in terracotta, and this became the dominant material utilized throughout Europe for creches. In the same period, the creche became increasingly popular in German-speaking countries in Europe, where wooden statues and wooden mannequins and cloth garments prevailed. In France, Spain, and Portugal, terracotta was the predominant material. So the Neapolitan creche migrated to Spain with the Bourbon court and flourished for quite some time before setting across the seas again to the New World. So once the creche became affirmed in Spain, a lot of the Portuguese and Spanish explorers took this with them to the New World, specifically South America. And the missionaries, again, saw the creche as an opportunity for evangelizing the indigenous people in those areas. So over the course of the 18th century, the tradition of the creche suffered a period of unquestionable degradation under the Enlightenment. Only in the next century was it brought back to its zenith during the Romantic era. With the passing of the age of artistic patronage, important commissions began to decrease in the 18th century. Consequently, the creche was used less and less in churches and aristocratic homes. But at the same time, its use became more widespread among all levels of society. As it became more popular, its elements of domestic ritual were accentuated. Figurines were produced at low cost in clay, plaster, and paper mache to satisfy the needs of a greater audience. Artists were replaced by craftsmen who often used molds, and old motifs were repeated without achieving original solutions. However, it was precisely in this century that the creche returned to its more simple form of spontaneous popular expression, a form easily bypassed in wealthy Baroque homes. So even though the creche lost its sumptuous, it gained a poetic flair in the folk art adaptations. So moving to the Amelia and James Govan collection we have at Luma, right now we've got over 600 pieces in the display or in the collection, and we can display different creches every 6 to 7 years at our exhibit without overlapping or reusing any of them. So even visitors who like to come as a holiday tradition and come year after year, they'll always see a new set exhibited. And hopefully by the time we go through the cycle, they've forgotten about the ones that they saw in earlier years. There are a few that will put out year after year as their crowd favorites or particularly significant to the Govan family or to the museum. A lot of these are the ones that I've been highlighting in the presentation. So Amelia and James Govan began collecting creches in the 1970s. The character of their collection evolved over time. It developed slowly at the beginning, but by the early 1980s, there were only 25 creches in their collection. The demands of work and family life allowed them very little time to focus on collecting, not necessarily having the resources to purchase them or to travel as much as they would like. And so during this period, they passed up many creches that were readily available in shops each Christmas in favor of expanding their collection to be as representative as possible of all the different cultures, countries, geographical locations that celebrate and have creches. So during the 1980s, they became interested in learning more about the historic development of the creche tradition. So initially they just started off collecting them, and then after about 10 years wanted to really dig into the history and research behind them. So James began to search out books and articles, and they gathered materials on folk art and related cultural traditions. By the late 1980s, the collection had grown from roughly 100 pieces to more than 400. So James and Amelia became more committed to documenting them, learning as much as possible about how they were made and the individuals who made them. Depending on how the nativities were acquired, the amount of information available varied from non-existent to abundant. In some cases, James was lucky enough to have detailed conversations with the makers and artists themselves. And by then, they also had more opportunities to travel abroad and purchase more unique and better produced creches. Wherever they traveled, whatever the season, they continued their search. So by 1990, the collection had grown too large to be exhibited in their home. They began to explore the possibility of exhibiting at churches and elsewhere to stimulate interest in the creche tradition. Disappointed by the limited amount of information available in English, they also began to entertain the notion of writing a book about the tradition in their collection, which they very much did complete. Given the growth of the collection and their desire to find special creches, especially fine works of art, it became more important to them that they do this research and have it readily available and available to the public and other collectors, since even with all their research, they still hadn't necessarily found kind of a definitive text on the tradition yet. So they focused on locating gifted artists in creches of certain cultures and continued to travel both abroad and within the United States. As a result, by the year 2000, the collection exceeded 300 creches. It had been and exhibited publicly several times, and they had commissioned nearly 30 creches as well. So as they went through their search, there were certain cultures or artistic styles that they just could not find examples of creches that they were happy with. So they had contracted with a number of artists to create them specifically to represent and fill in gaps in their collection. After the museum acquired the majority of the pieces in 2005, we also commissioned about half a dozen different creches for specific exhibits or anniversaries. So we still continue to build the collection through commissions as well as donations. But before the collection came to Loyola, the first opportunity for the Govans to exhibit their vast creche collection came in 1990. They're invited to show the collection at the Paul Institute of the Arts in Washington, D.C., an agency of the Archdiocese of Washington. So the collection was also exhibited from 2001 to 2005 at the Pope John Paul II Cultural Center. So it was not long after this that Luma opened in 2005, and that Amelia and James Govan Creche collection came to Loyola. So right now we've got close to 600 different creches in the collection that represent every country on Earth, including many that no longer exist. And we also try to create a theme every year around what creches that we choose to put on display. So as I mentioned, a priority is to make sure that we don't repeat creches year after year unless they're very popular, specifically requested. But we also don't just pick them at random. We try to come up with a different theme. So this year's theme was keeping holiday traditions, which we thought was pretty appropriate given we were challenged to still have the Creche exhibit this year with the other photography show we have in our main galleries. Next year's exhibit, we're considering or wanting to do one based around music and songs and carols. And in addition to having the creches out, is have an opportunity to listen to the relevant music or song. So yeah, if you notice, this year's exhibit was a bit smaller and less involved than usual. Next year, we're hoping to make up for that by going much larger and in depth. And so I think one of the best ways to just share the collection is, again, going through a lot of our more well-known pieces. I'm also going to play a short video clip here. It's from a few years ago, but it shows the creches much better than some of these 2D photos can.
Word for crib. Presepio is the Italian word for crib. Both terms are synonymous with the traditional nativity scene. Whatever you call them, a vast and varied collection is now on display. They are part of an annual exhibition to celebrate the Christmas season. Inside the Loyola University Museum of Art, there is a maternity unit with more than 100 newborns. These tableaux, of course, represent the birth of Jesus in a stable in Bethlehem. This year, they come from 80 different countries.
We have a little over 500 now, and we're only able to show about 100 every year, so we rotate what we have up on display. One of the wonderful things about the exhibition is that every artist has their own interpretation, and oftentimes it's through the lens of their own cultural heritage. So we see it localized, particularly there's certain animals from certain countries. The architecture definitely changes with every piece, and the characters they choose to include, that varies as well.
Variations include an ostrich egg used as a canvas, a tiny set piece inside a walnut shell, and a palace made from tinfoil. Also on view, a pair of unusual works with a Midwestern pedigree.
This piece is from an artist from Michigan, and as you can see, she's reimagined the tools in her kitchen drawer. So a lovely reminder that things very simple and mundane can be transformed into wonderful art. This piece is from a local artist, Jean Mormon Unsworth, and we like to call this the Nativity in the City. So if you look at the background here at these towering wood pieces, it should sort of remind you of the skyscrapers you might see walking in our front door. So this piece was commissioned specifically for the 10th anniversary by the museum, and it was made by an artist from Oaxaca, Mexico. His name is Carlos Orozco. He has his own organization which supports indigenous artists local in Oaxaca. And he and the artists he usually works with are known for carving alebrijes, which are little animal figures painted with geometric patterns.
Most of these nativity scenes were made in the 20th century. They were collected by friends of the museum, the Govan family, who hail from southern Illinois.
We get a chance to see how the same story, which we view as a Christian story, of course, can be interpreted by artists from countries that aren't predominantly Christian. So some of the pieces are made by Buddhist artists, some of the pieces are made by Muslim artists. So it's really interesting to see how faith and spirituality can be interpreted in different ways. But you can see it as a story just about a family in the simplest sense as well. Our mission as a museum is art illuminating the spirit, and we have connected that to Loyola's mission, thinking on a global scale about spirituality and social justice as well. So I think the idea of getting to see all of these different countries in the same location and thinking about the world in a more global and international sense, I think that really is showcased here.
This year marks the 10th annual presentation of the exhibition called The Art and Faith of the Creche. It's at the Loyola University Museum of Art through January 7th.
Right. Okay, so this clip was a couple years old, but like I said, I still thought it did a much better job of showing and highlighting a lot of the creches we have, being able to see them more in 3D than the photos that I've had up here. So at that time, we did just have a little over 500. As I mentioned before, we're now nearly up to 600. So the Creche collection is not just something that we bring out during the holidays, although that's definitely when it's highlighted. We still make use of it at the museum and also at the university. So for example, this past year, we collaborated with Loyola's public history department, where I had graduated from, for new students to do exhibit labels and blog posts on some of the different creches we have in the collection. So as those assignments start to come in, we'll be posting those on the museum's website 1 or 2 times a week, just to highlight some of the lesser known pieces that we have. So many of the pieces we do have great provenance on. James or Mr. Govan was able to collect them directly from the artist or collect a lot of information when he purchased them. But others, like I said, have very little provenance. Many we don't know the date or the artist or even the location to be 100% sure. We can usually tell based on the style, but yeah, some have less research than we'd like. So each year we've been partnering with history and art history students to delve into those lesser known pieces and fill out a lot of the gaps that we have in the collection. So they're able to help the museum by giving us more information, but they're also gaining excellent firsthand research and writing experience skills. Yeah. As you can see, the collection ranges from fine art pieces to folk art to very Midwestern piece with cheese grater and wine cork. But the pieces we have in the collection representing modern day creches are very different from some of those very earlier ones I had mentioned. They've grown in what figures are included, the materials that are used. They've gone from, many of them are still produced and handmade one-off pieces by artists and craftspeople, and there are many that are mass-produced. We have one in our collection that is a pop-up creche that's all paper and open, it's folded and opens up. And so while not, one of the more artistically inspired pieces, it does show kind of the commercialization of Creche and how it's evolved over the years. So many of our pieces, creches have several different figures that can be arranged and changed year after year. But I'd say maybe about a fourth of them are closer to this example, where it's all one statue or piece that's come together and that can't really be moved around. Our Creche collection also ranges very much different sizes. Our biggest pieces stand nearly 3 feet tall, and our smallest ones, one that was highlighted in the video, is in a walnut shell. The whole scene is captured in half the walnut shell. This specific piece here looks rather large, but all of these figurines are less than an inch tall. So yeah, some of these still very much require a lot of skill and talent to create. The majority of the collection does consist of those figurines, but we do have a number of reliefs as well. And so these more closely resemble those very early and first examples of the nativity in creches. Some of them are very detailed, as you saw earlier, and intricate, and very realistic. However, a lot of them are also very abstract and more notional. This example, it's very clear, what each figure represents, but it's much more modern and restrained than a lot of the earlier examples. And so just showing the different materials, a lot of them are wood and clay or terracotta, but we do have a few metal pieces as well. And so this Creche combines kind of the more traditional figurines, which with that large relief in the background. And one of the more interesting self-contained units is this piece from Germany. And unfortunately, we don't have the artist or the date, but it is very interesting to see this one in action. Is each of the candles at the bottom are lit, the warm rising air spins the fan or windmill at the top. So given we're in a museum, we don't usually have the candles lit, but we do occasionally light them for specific presentations or exhibit openings. So that highlights the majority of the pieces from our collection. Yeah, if you get a chance to head to the museum before it closes today to check out the creches, I highly recommend it. I'll be there for a bit as well to answer any more questions in the exhibit. Excuse me, my voice is going. But yeah, that's everything I have. Highlighted a lot of our better known pieces, and hope you enjoy seeing the variety of the creches in our collection. Again, we would not have this without James Govan, who's still with us. He lives in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and is still very much involved in the Creche exhibits from year to year. We'll often go back and ask him questions about specific pieces that we don't have information on. We also work with him on setting the different themes for each year. And he also continues to support the collection financially with a special endowment that allows us to conserve and preserve the creches as need be, as well as commission certain pieces for specific anniversaries and dates. So Mr. Govan still has, I think, close to 60 creches in his home. He puts everyone out during the holidays. And so, yeah, hopefully, he'll continue to be a significant partner at the museum, and we can continue to preserve and display a collection that him and his wife have literally spent a lifetime building and putting together. So thank you very much. I'm glad I was able to share a bit of the history of Creche and especially delve into the collection we have over at Loyola University's Museum of Art.
Thank you. We've got a bunch of questions, Kyle, so let's go over here. Cynthia.
Kyle, are the pieces from the collection ever requested to be displayed at other museums around the country?
Yes, we didn't do it this year, but in previous years, there is a very large creche organization down in Peoria in central Illinois. So every year we'll usually send between 30 to 50 creches down for their display, which runs for a number of months. For whatever reason, this year they didn't reach out to us, but we've been doing it, I think, for the previous 4 or 5 years outside of 2020. We have had other organizations and museums, both locally in Chicago and across the US, request specific creches. Usually it's not for a holiday show, but more so that they're doing an exhibit over a specific artist or style of art. And one of the creches in our collection either represents a period in that artist's life or is a very good example of a specific art style or medium. But yes, we do loan out the creches and continue to make them available to other museums and institutions that are interested in borrowing them.
Okay. Any other questions? Alan.
Just a quick question about the book, the date and the availability of the book that you've got there.
Yeah, so the book, I believe you could purchase it through Amazon or other stores online. We also have several copies at the museum that we sell. The price I'm blanking on at the moment, but this book was published in the early 2000s. It was written by Mr. Govan. There's a smaller companion guide, I guess you could call it, that highlights even more of the creches in his collection and at Loyola. But yeah, it's it still very much is the kind of seminal text on creches, because Mr. Govan, as I'd mentioned, they just couldn't find a lot of the information they were looking for on the tradition, especially in North America. And so since he couldn't find it, he decided to write it himself. He certainly had the experience and knowledge to do so. So the title is Art of the Creche, Nativities from Around the World by James L. Govan.
Good.
Thanks for this great presentation. Can you tell us anything about the Govan family or what brought their interest into doing something like this? Were they artistic people, or I assume they followed the Catholic faith from a couple things you said? Any insight into what makes someone have this great idea to do this huge collection?
Yes, so from what Mr. Govan has shared and what I've learned from talking to him since I started the museum, he's definitely our most involved donor in a positive way. I think it started out in the early 70s as him and his wife Amelia had very much enjoyed creches as children growing up, and so they started out with just a few that they would have at the holidays. But as time went on, they found that they kept buying them and getting more before I think they got up to the mid 20s to 30s before they kind of realized what they were doing and that they were actually building quite the collection. And so, yeah, from there, it just kind of took off. In the early 70s and 80s, they were working full time, raising a family. Amelia had a PhD and worked as a doctor, so they didn't have a whole lot of time and resources to travel and collect as many creches as they would like. But yeah, as their children got older, They had more time for travel, more resources to seek out, specific artists and styles, and even reach out and commission about 30 pieces or so. Fortunately, Amelia Govan passed away before the book was published and the collection came to Luma. Excuse me. I think a lot of the motivation and impetus to really get these books published and to get the creches to a permanent home where they could be displayed year after year without having to worry about jumping around to different organizations really came from Mr. Govan wanting to honor his wife's memory and continue continue that tradition and this activity that had bonded them together for so many years. So yeah, her name definitely still lives on in the collection, as it's titled the Amelia and James Govan collection. So if you haven't been, one of our main and really only text panel goes over a bit of that history, and it was partially written by Mr. Govan to, again, emphasize why they started this and why he's continued with it for over 50 years at this point.
Rebecca?
I apologize if I was being inattentive as you began your presentation, Kyle. I associate the creche, or the beginning of that idea, with St. Francis of Assisi. Have you been to St. Peter's in the Loop, the Catholic Church? There's a wonderful frieze depicting scenes from St. Francis's life, and one of them is a creche. And we were taught as docents that that was the origin of the idea of the creche. It shows his birth, supposedly. Does that sound like just lore, or are you familiar with that piece of lore?
So admittedly, I don't have a strong background in art history or Catholicism, but in the research I've done for the Creche exhibit and for this presentation and digging more into it, that kind of seemed to be the most common explanation that I had found as well. So I'm still learning more. I can't say, I don't want to say definitively, but from what I've read so far, that seems to be the most popular opinion by scholars.
Okay, Cynthia?
I'm curious to know if you know, is there an artistic style designation? For example, would this be considered folk art, or is there some other category that it would fall into?
Do you mean this specific one, or creches in general? A lot of modern creches, especially the ones in our collection, would be considered folk art. Just because of the artists are hyper local, the materials they use are also often hyper local, and the style usually very much reflects the geographical location that it comes from. Although we do have some, and Mr. Govan collected more, I guess, fine art examples that more resembled kind of the, I would say ostentatious, but maybe more detailed or involved pieces that were popular during the Baroque era. But those are definitely the minority in the collection. Most of them, and I think, to me at least, the more interesting ones are the more folk art ones that have a bit more story, and their histories grounded very specifically in that artist or in the community who created them. A lot of the creches we have were a team effort to make. Many of them the whole thing was done by one artist, but a lot of them, especially some of the wooden ones from Africa come to mind. There'll be a set of carvers who will carve the figurines. And then from there, it will go to the painters who will do all the detail painting and finishing work. And so a lot of these show different styles and expressions within the creche itself, just because a lot of times there are multiple artists or organizations involved in creating them.
Any more questions? We can take a couple more here. I'm giving John a break from running around here. I'm kind of, you mentioned that some of them are mass produced, so they're probably not very valuable, but have any of these been assessed to be very rare? Or are they insured? I mean, I'm kind of interested in valuation.
To my knowledge, we've had them valued as far as insurance. So the museum's insurance policy can remain up to date. But I think a lot of them, it's very difficult to place a monetary value on just because they are so unique. I mean, a lot of them are just one of a kind as they were produced by a specific artist or craftsman. Probably 40 or so, a little over, were specific commissions that the Govan family or the museum had sought out. Yeah, to my knowledge, we haven't really had any appraised outside of just for the insurance value, but I would imagine several of them would be particularly valuable just given how unique they are, and many are one of a kind. But if something is one of a kind, then how do you base the price on it? So I think that was also one of the reasons is difficult to assign a price when there's not a whole lot to compare it to. Yeah, sorry, it's not a complete answer, but yeah, we aside from insurance haven't really had them appraised.
Okay, did I see one more hand? No.
I do have a question for you, because I know when growing up and setting up Christmas decorations, the creche always took a good amount of time because you're unwrapping multiple pieces, you're setting up the actual structure and laying down the moss, blah, blah, blah. How long does it take you to set up your exhibit? Because, I'm talking one and you're talking 100.
Yeah, so this last show that has 33 pieces in it took me about 3 days just to set up the creches. So that doesn't include setting up the plinths, doing the painting, the design. Yeah, just setting up the nativity scenes themselves took about 3 days, and that was with the help of some art history students as well. So usually we have photos of how the artist had wanted them or had chosen to arrange them. And so we usually try to follow the artist's vision with them as closely as we can. For ones where we don't have that or don't know the artist, or there wasn't a specific arrangement stipulated, we'll kind of change it up from year to year, and it depends on the person who's setting out that specific scene.
Much, Kyle. Certainly, this has been fabulous.
Thank you.